We can't eat. We can't eat. We can't eat. 3D Daytona. Daytona USA on the Saturn is a game that arrived at the wrong time and for the wrong system, but was unfortunately positioned as an important title for the system due to its immense popularity in arcades. It was also placed head-to-head against Ridge Racer, which received a similarly timed port to the PlayStation in 1995. With the Saturn being a much better system for 2D games, a technically advanced 3D title like Daytona USA was always going to be a difficult proposition for the Saturn, and sadly it falls down in quite a few places. Firstly, the performance takes a massive hit. I don't think anyone was expecting arcade perfect 60 FPS, but a stable 30 FPS was pretty much the expected norm during that console generation, so the fact that the Saturn version runs at 20 FPS is pretty shocking. This makes the game feel choppy and unresponsive, which is a huge problem for a game like Daytona, which relies on quick reflexes to master its fairly deep handling model. The next issue is the draw distance. Saturn Daytona has a very short draw distance, and there's been no attempt to mitigate this with any fading or fog, so you get this dodgy looking pop-in that is very sudden and abrupt. Finally, there's an issue of content. The Saturn version of Daytona USA features no additional circuits or cars, but one additional mode called Saturn Mode, which allows you to play the 3 circuits with a more traditional lap-based structure and no time limit. You can at least play with the Hornet's second player livery as a little extra, but there's just not enough game here to keep your attention. You'd feel pretty hard done by if you paid full price for this at launch. But here's the thing, I personally feel that this might be the best home port of Daytona USA until we receive the HD version on PS3 and 360 in 2011. While the 1996 Championship Circuit Edition added more tracks and cars and 30 FPS performance, it doesn't look like the arcade game. The car models have been greatly simplified and the liveries don't match the arcade version at all. The 2001 Dreamcast port certainly ramps up the frame rate to arcade quality and enhances the visuals, but the handling is so overly sensitive it renders the game unplayable without a race controller. The original Saturn port might have a lot of problems, but it at least looks and feels like the arcade original. The handling model is replicated perfectly, and the cars look like their arcade counterparts, with the correct proportions and liveries. You may argue that visuals aren't everything, but they are a huge part of a game's identity, and when I play a home port of Daytona USA, I want the damn thing to look like Daytona USA, and the 1995 Saturn port absolutely does. The 1996 Circuit Edition doesn't, with its overly simplistic car models. The 2001 Dreamcast version doesn't, with its weird flattened car model that has the wheels sticking out too far. That's why I think the original Saturn port is the best home console version of Daytona we had until the 2011 HD version. It evokes the spirit of the arcade original better than it really has any right to on a console that is not made to render 3D graphics of this quality. Yes, it has problems, but despite all these I still have a soft spot for this port because it looks and feels like my experience with Daytona USA in the arcade. I genuinely don't feel like the 20 FPS performance really spoils it, and I can cope with the pop-in because we just did back in this console generation. Loads of games had noticeable pop-in, but it was the sacrifice you had to make for 3D gaming on relatively cheap hardware. Daytona USA on Saturn is definitely not a great port, but I think it's unfairly maligned for weaknesses in the Saturn's hardware that it could never overcome, and despite this, it still looks and plays like Daytona USA.
Welcome to Victory Lane. You made it.